הנה מה טוב ומה נעים, שבת אחים גם יחד. הנה מה טוב ומה נעים, שבת אחים גם יחד.
Shalom and welcome to Jewish Insights. Today is an exciting day for me for a variety of reasons. The first and most important of which is that I get to be in conversation with my teacher and my Rebbe, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg. Rabbi Yitz Greenberg needs no introduction and is certainly no stranger to JBS. He's the president of the J.J. Greenberg Institute for the Advancement of Jewish Life and is the senior scholar in residence at Hadar. He created many things over the years that have totally shaped Jewish life as we know it, including the creation of Klal with Eli Wiesel, which pioneered the idea of lay leadership learning as well as pluralistic learning. He was the founding president of the Jewish Life Network, the Steinhardt Foundation, which led to Birthright Israel. He was the executive director of the President's Commission on the Holocaust, which was with my grandfather, Murray Pantier. So the museum in Washington, lay leadership learning, pluralistic learning, and birthright, only a few small elements of the Jewish world that have been influenced and really seeded by Rabbi Yitz Greenberg. In addition to that, he's written some of the most important essays and books of the past century for the Jewish people. His book, The Jewish Way, is one that I keep nearby at all times, and any holiday that's coming that I want to think about how to navigate, that's my first place to check. My personal experience with Rav Yitz begins, I guess, initially with my grandfather, but I did not know that, being on the Holocaust Commission with Rav Yitz. But later, Rav Yitz was my father's teacher in Wexner, the Wexner Heritage Foundation Fellowship, and then him and Blue came to our community, Eitz Chaim in Livingston, New Jersey, for the Yamim Noraim, for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur one year. So I had the chance to get to know him there. And then I was a student at Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, where I had Rav Yitz for several classes. And there is where I truly began to encounter and understand Rav Yitz as a human being, as a mensch, and also his ideas and his theology, and where I first became familiar with the Jewish way. It totally changed my life forever. I think as someone who's always searching, it created an outlook, a way of thinking about the world through Rav Yitz's theology that I carry with me to this day. For example, the idea of covenant, the covenant between the Jewish people and God, and the covenant between a husband and wife, for example, or two partners, are examples of ways that I think about covenant. The idea of being created in God's image, the idea that every human being is infinitely valuable, equal in value, and unique, and that we are meant to strive to live our lives in a way that reflects that, is something that I carry with me every day as well. And the list can go on. How to think about Holocaust, how to think about Israel, how to think about Tikkun Olam, all those elements. I had the amazing zchut, my wife Talia and I, to have Rav Yitz be the Mussar Kedushin, the officiant at our wedding ceremony. And then I had another amazing zchut and merit, which was that when I graduated rabbinical school, when I received my smicha and became a rabbi, I had the opportunity to work close with Rav Yitz, to come to his home each day and to sit and learn with him and to work on a variety of projects, and also to be in his home and see what it's like for him to call his children and grandchildren and have those conversations, and how he interacts with Blue and how they build a home of covenant. And one of the projects we work on during this time was picking up a manuscript that Rav Yitz actually started back in 1969, which was which was in a commentary and translation of a book called Or Yisrael. Or Yisrael is the work of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, the founder of the Mussar movement. The Mussar movement is let's call it, if all of Torah, if all of Jewish text is about describing how we should behave in the world, then the Mussar movement is about creating a movement around that it's not just enough to study the Torah or to study ethics of our fathers, that we have to create institutions and practices to build Jewish character that reflects Torah values. And so Rav Yitz, and he'll share today around this, was a student of Mussar and had worked on this manuscript, and we picked it up again in 2016 and spent 3 years working regularly on updating the translation, working on a commentary, and very excitingly, it was published this week. So it's right here. We have the book in our hand for the first time. So this is it. Or Yisrael and Other Writings, published by our friends at Koren, and co-published by Sefaria as well. It'll eventually be available online as well, which is very exciting. And Rav Yitz and I, have gone deep into this space, and it seemed like a perfect time to discuss because the book came out and also because we're in the middle of a series right now talking about Torah giants. As you prepare for Shavuot, who are the thinkers, sometimes overlooked and sometimes less overlooked, who we might spend time learning a little bit more as you prepare. So people like Rav Kook, people like Nechama Leibovitz, people like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and the Zohar, and now today Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. And so I'll say a couple words and then I want to hear from Rav Yitz. So Rav Yisrael Salanter lived during the 19th century. I mentioned he was the founder of the Mussar movement, and he really shaped Mussar as we know it today, and also shaped many other areas of Jewish life that are less obviously connected to him, similarly to Rav Yitz actually. So one thing that I think many people don't know about Rav Yitz is that he has this whole background in Mussar, and that he actually grew up going to a Mussar yeshiva, and for that I want to turn to him to start to hear that story. So Rav Yitz, thanks for waiting for my introduction there. It's such a pleasure to see you. We're Zooming. You're in Israel and I'm in New York here, and it's great to see you in your office and to connect with you. Welcome to Jewish Insights.
I'm grateful for the opportunity. And let me just say, you just heard a wonderful presentation, but in typical Justin Pine's fashion, he is one of extraordinarily talented and able person, but he said almost nothing about himself. So I would like to just point out famous Talmudic comment. I learned a lot from my teachers. I learned even more from my colleagues, and most of all from my students. So I want to say that Justin in particular, as a student, called me back to my Mussar roots, so to speak. I actually went to a Mussar yeshiva, a refugee yeshiva, I'll talk about it in just a second, and was very much affected by it, but I'd sort of gotten involved in other issues, particularly consumed by struggling with the Holocaust, and sort of neglected it. And it was Justin who called me back to say, this is important, I'd like to work on it, I'd like to learn it with you. So let me just return that lovely introduction with a reminder of what his contribution to the situation is, not least of which co-translator, co-editor, and co-commentator. I want to start by saying, how did I get to this situation? I was a child of an immigrant family, American immigrant family. My parents came from Poland in 1925. My father, in 1929, he brought my mother and 3 sisters with him to America. My brother and I were born in America. Like other children of immigrant parents, I wanted to be all American. That was my father's great dream, my parents' great dream, and mine. And I was going the path of modern Orthodoxy, meaning went to modern Orthodox schools and remained observant. The family was observant. My mother deeply religious, my father a teacher of Talmud, what was called Chaber Shas in those days, people who studied Talmud every day. In any event, that was my background, and I was going the usual modern Orthodox route, Yeshiva University High School in Brooklyn, and I was about to go to Yeshiva University College for the college level. My father would taught Talmud every day at Bethel, which was the fancy Orthodox synagogue in Borough Park in those days, which was on 48th Street and 15th Avenue. My home was on 13th and 49th. And as he walked from one to the other, he passed a building, a sort of modest building where the Beis Yosef Novaradak Seminary, a refugee yeshiva, existed. And sometimes he was tired, he would stop off and he would go inside and learn there and talk with the teachers. Anyway, sometime in May, I was about to graduate from high school. The Rosh Yeshiva turned to my father, the head of the Beis Yosef, and said to him, you know, we've been thinking seriously of taking in American boys. The school itself consisted really a remarkable group of about 40 people. Half of them had survived the concentration camps, and the other half had survived Siberia, where Russia sent many Jewish refugees from Poland trying to escape the Nazis to Siberian slave labor camps, where many of them suffered and some died. In any event, they had come through all this, came to America, and I must say they couldn't make up their mind if they want to let in Americans, outsiders, newcomers, to share what is such an intense and overwhelming experience of life. But luckily for me, that week, they thought they would. said to my father, you know any boys who might be interested? My father came home, said to me, you know, of this school, Rosh Yeshiva said to me, they're thinking of American boys letting them in. Would you like to go? I said, I have no idea. Should I? What do you think it's a good school? Looks at me and said, you know something? They have this Mussar. I'm not so sure about that. But I have spoken to the Rosh Yeshiva. He's really a great Talmud scholar. You'll get a good, solid Talmud education there. It might be really worth trying. So we said, we'll try. So we go on one night during the week. Again, it wasn't the wisest thing. We go and the night Seder. The night Seder is no formal teaching, no formal lectures, no formal conversations about Mussar or ethics. Beit Yosef, however, was in Europe one of the most radical and completely committed to Mussar, which is to say, to take time out of your education and work on your character, work on your personal behavior patterns, try to develop a more ethical and a more human approach to life. And they kept it in America. Well, we were sitting there. I had no idea of any of this. We're sitting there. My father and I are studying, and everybody else is studying privately. What I didn't know was that in the Mussar tradition, Salanter himself invented this. They have intellectual learning, text study, but also what he called limud b'hispilus, to learn with emotion, enthusiasm, total immersion. I don't know anything. 15 minutes before Ma'ariv at night, that's what they do. So my father and I are learning, and I suddenly realize that everybody else in the room is quiet. No one is saying a word. They're sort of thinking, meditating. So I stop. And suddenly, in the table across from me, the young man jumped up and at the top of his lungs started to scream, jealousy, lust, desire for honor, remove a person from this world and destroy a person's life. He not only shouted this, but he then started to march up and down the room, chanting it, singing it, repeating it, dancing it. That in itself took me aback, but suddenly the whole room exploded. And the other table, someone started to scream his text. And within a few minutes, I was overwhelmed by a tsunami of chanting, laughing, crying, dancing, chanting different verses of self-critique, self-improvement, religious devotion. It was like a storm. For 15 minutes, I sat there sort of stunned. I had never experienced this in my life. And then when it finally stopped for Ma'ariv, I turned to my father and said, I'm going here. I'm not. I tell people, it reminds me of that scene from when Harry met Sally, where he sits there in the restaurant and this person in the restaurant reenacts the experience of an orgasm. And at the peak, he turns to the waiter and says, I want to order that also.
Right, I'll have what she's having.
Anyway, that's how I felt. That's how I felt. I couldn't wait. And the truth is, when I did go, again, I was overwhelmed by the experience. People had developed, first of all, they had developed a tremendous sense of trust and deep faith and walking with God. I mean, looking back, how else do you survive a concentration camp? How else do you manage to get through Siberia without being broken? Sure. So they had this deep sense of trust and walking with God that I had never experienced before. They had a sense of internal equilibrium and discipline. You don't get frightened, you don't get agitated, you don't get shaken by the opinion of others. One of the most important impacts they had on me, because we had exercises to learn not to be moved or changed. If you have a strong commitment and a belief, you don't let people's opposition, criticism, disagreement, dismissal touch you any more than you let their praise turn your head. You just have to really have a strong internal compass. And that was some of the things I learned from them. And the truth is, I wanted to be like them. I mean, my Rebbe, the one I became closest to, was the Mashgiach, the spiritual guide in the school. And just one small example, he had two little boys who came to visit regularly. Now, the second one, Daniel, was a particularly willful and obstreperous child, you might say. And again, he constantly interrupted, constantly provoked. I never saw a father handle a child with such patience, unfailing good spirit, kindness. And eventually, Daniel sort of worked it through. But again, I wanted to be like these people. And of course, to be fair, they were nice enough to let me in, at least to fairly deep into the system, if not completely. For example, again, once every week, the Mashgiach, the spiritual director, gave a talk on the character, self-development, ethical behavior. But every other week, he gave you a private session. It was almost like Mussar self-analysis. You talk about your issues, your problems. He would give you his diagnosis, his suggestions, his estimate of your behavior and your character and where you have to work on. Second example, they had what they called a VAD. It was a kind of a committee. 5 or 6 students together, and they admitted me into at least one of them. And again, the students would talk about their personal growth, their personal spiritual challenges and difficulties, their bad habits, what they're working on to improve. Each person would report, and then the group would go around saying, critique where he was right, where he was wrong, where he thought he was improving, but he wasn't, where he was completely oblivious to a real problem. It was a very powerful and continuous form of self and group analysis and criticism. And the third example is, there was a book by a man named Mendel Leffin, which Rabbi Eliezer Salanter had printed and reprinted in the 19th century. Leffin took 13 personal qualities. I remember the tranquility of the soul, initiative and energy to accomplish and do your work faithfully, spiritual communing. Each of these personal qualities, kindness, patience, they picked 13 of them. You took one a week, 13 weeks, and that's 4 times a year. For that 1 week, you worked on that quality. You kept a diary. You analyzed and criticized what you did. You asked for help from others to assess you. And so you tried to improve that quality in yourself for a whole week, and then went on to the next one. I could go on, but the point is, I wanted to be like them. I envied them. I took these exercises very seriously and brought the central point of Salanter, which is that Judaism is a religion, is about, as he put it, the Torah came to make a mensch. Judaism is about becoming a human being, a good, kind, responsible, ethical, loving human being. And that needs time, it needs energy, it needs strategy, educational effort, guidance, friends, and teacher. And that certainly was a message that I got from them.
Beautiful, thank you. And first of all, that image of you in the Beit Midrash, the house of study, and busy studying with your father, and all of a sudden it getting quiet, and then one by one each student standing on a table and chanting a line from scripture around that'll inspire them is just something, we don't see things like that these days anymore, but it's very, very powerful, and I can really relate to that. So I want to just pull out a few of the things that you said. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but again, if we're characterizing Mussar as, let's call it the journey of trying to become a mensch, trying to work on one's character, and this both encompasses areas between a human, and also a human and God, or a human and themselves, right? So I might want to be more patient, or have more respect, or be more kind to my neighbor, but I also might want to work on my trust in God, or work on my faith in God, or those kinds of things. And so what Rav Salanter, what I hear you describing is, those texts are already there. You're sitting and studying Talmud in a Beit Midrash, in a house of study, you're studying the weekly Torah portion. There are stories around what the ideal is, but with this Navardic yeshiva, which was one of the schools of studies that branched out from Rav Salanter, what they were practicing was saying, okay, in the image of Rav Salanter, it's not enough to have texts that describe how to be. we need some sort of strategy or practices to clarify, what can get us there. And then some of the things you described were, first was that hitpa'alut, or hispa'alus as you called it, this idea of, whipping oneself up emotionally, right? It's not enough for me to just read the idea that lust and jealousy and seeking honor remove a person from the world. I need to stand on a table and say it over and over again for 15 minutes so that it becomes part of who I am. And then the others were, having a rabbi tell inspiring stories to inspire you to behave a certain way, and also having one-on-one opportunities to discuss your personal growth with them. And this idea of, having regular self-critique, sitting down and kind of like, it's almost like doing an accounting, right? Doing accounting of not just our finances, but of our souls. And then finally, this idea that you described of, working with, picking 13 attributes and having them be in a cycle over the course of the year, where once every 13 weeks you have each 4 times you have each of the character traits. So these are all different versions of practices to how we get where we want to be, how we become the person, the mensch, to use your word, that we want to become. So I want to zoom out for a second, and I want to ask, about Rav Salanter himself, about who he was and how that happened. I think, inherent in what you're describing is a sense that he comes at a point in history where he feels like, just reading the text is not enough. Something else needs to happen. We need some sort of movement here. So tell us a little about, who was Rav Salanter? What was his story? Why did he evolve in his thinking in the way that he did, and how did his thinking evolve?
Well, first of all, his dates, 1810 to 1881. Mm-hmm. And he started as a child prodigy, not unusual for the great scholars of the time, a child prodigy, and yet, unlike other child prodigies, and some of whom grew up to be great scholars, he developed in a very distinctive way of his own. And the most central of this is his recognition of the psychological, the human, the personal characteristic dimension of religious life. One could think of it, in fact, the truth is, Beis Yosef originally presented him to me. He was not the main focus of my school. As you mentioned, Beis Yosef was a offshoot. There were 3 major schools or movements under Salanter's banner, started by students who were inspired by him to create a yeshiva that would focus on these kinds of developments. So Beis Yosef was the most radical in Europe, and I must say their conception was the only way to do that is to break your ego. The truth is, I look back sometimes and say, if I would have joined them in Europe, I probably would have revolted because it could be pretty harsh and pretty demanding and sometimes pretty bruising.
Sorry, give an example. Like, how would they break your ego?
Well, I'll give one of a slightly different version, which is they wanted to train people not to look for approval or for expectation of the crowd's support or approval. So they do exercises and doing things that people would laugh at or dismiss, but they in fact would learn. Therefore, that I did what I did, and I'm not fazed by the attitude of people. So again, one example, famous example, they'd send a student to a pharmacy. He'd walk in and he'd say, "I need a medicine," and the fellow would say, "Well, I need a pound of Yirah Shamayim, a pound of fear of God." And of course, the pharmacist or the customers thought he was bananas, but of course, you get it. Yeah. Or he would sometimes go to a pharmacy and say, "I want to buy a pound of nails." Well, of course, the fellow would say, go to the carpenter down the block. But again, the answer was, he wanted the student to develop a sense that I have no ego, and nothing I do to improve my character phases me and makes me embarrassed, even if it makes me the laughing stock of other people, because I don't have an ego, and who cares what people think about me. Mm-hmm. When it expressed it again in a certain way, which I would have revolted if I was in Europe, was, again, not to enjoy the delights of this world. In other words, food, yeah, you eat because you have to eat. But you don't certainly become a connoisseur of fine dining. You don't look for delicious, special experiences. You do what you have to do. But again, this is not about self-indulgence and physical delights. This is about living Spartanly, so to be freeing up to concentrate on religion. Mm-hmm. Again, of course, looking back, I realized the fires of the Holocaust, the fires of Siberia, mellowed them. And the truth is, my feeling that this is available and potential for contemporary people reflects the Beis Yosef of the American experience, which was mellowed and in a way more respectful or more willing to allow the individual to grow without trying to bust their pride or bust their self-abnegation to the nth degree. The other great thing which they focused on very much was, again, a Salanter idea, Zikri Harabim, to bring merit, to bring help, to enrich the life of the masses. What does that mean, enrich the life of the masses? Well, the answer is, if you will teach them a Torah that it helps them improve their character, be better husbands, be more honest businessmen, be richer and stronger friends and responsible citizens, then you have given them merit and given them a quality of life. And this is the greatest mitzvah, to bring Torah to them in a form that will help them become better human beings. They really drove that in Europe with their students when they got smicha, when they became rabbinically ordained. Their responsibility, first job, so to speak, they had to go out to find the Jewish community and organize a yeshiva ketana, an elementary school yeshiva. Before the war, Beis Yosef had something like 80 such schools in Poland. Tragically and heartbreakingly, most of them were destroyed. All of them were destroyed by the Nazis. Many of their students and their teachers killed or sent to concentration camps. But this idea, they put this bug in my head. And oh boy, this is interesting because I had this other very strong traditional feeling for my family. I want to be all-American. And my definition of all-American is I wanted to become an academic. And in fact, graduate school, I applied to Harvard University because in those days, Harvard was the acme of Americanism, the highest. I'm not sure we feel the same way today in the light of the current attitude of problems with Israel and Gaza, but be that as it may, it was at that time. And so I not only planned to go there, but I in fact went there for my PhD after receiving ordination at Beis Yosef. But because I was still keeping to my original plan to be an American academic, all-American. That was my Irving period. My real name, of course, being Yitzchak. My parents never called me anything other than Yitzchak. But when they came to the Brit and to the birth certificate, they said, what? We're going to stigmatize little Yitzchak with a foreign, greener, alien name like Yitzchak? They looked for the most white Anglo-Saxon Protestant name they could find, Irving. And that became my name. And the truth is I was trying to be Irving up till through graduate school. But of course, this other bug, it's like you shoot an elephant and they run 30 miles before they fall. This other bug was in me. And the truth is, after I began my academic career, encounter with the Holocaust sort of ended my dream of being an American academic and made me feel I want to serve the Jewish people. I want to help this broken and suffering people rebuild their lives, renew their lives, which of course is the great story of the 20th century. And so I got around to Beis Yosef's vision of being an educator and trying to bring Torah to the masses.
Got it. And so, Rav Yitz, a couple things. One is I hear you saying in describing Rav Salanter, two of the features of his work. One was the idea of taking into account, let's call it the subconscious or psychology, and then that applies across all areas. That applies, whether it's you're studying Torah and trying to decide what the halacha, what the law is, or whether you're justifying an action that you might otherwise not justify, that type of thing. And then I hear your second point around him saying a core thing that he focused on, Rav Salanter, was the masses, or at least he tried to focus on, engaging lay leaders, which is interesting because that's a flag that a banner that you carried into the 20th century when you worked on Klal with Elie Wiesel and really pioneered the idea of engaging lay leaders, post-college adults to learn Jewish areas. So I hear you also talking about how you mentioned how, in your own era, you responded to the moment. It felt like you needed to address what happened with the Holocaust, and that was in front of you. Take me back to Rav Salanter and kind of, he's coming of age in the 19th century, in the 1800s. Like you mentioned, he's aware of the subconscious, which affects his whole outlook. What else is going on, and how do his behaviors and choices reflect that?
It's an excellent question, excellent point you're making. And the truth is, you might say I had two eras myself of understanding Salanter, what he stood for. At Beis Yosef, he was presented to me as one of the not only great scholars, but as a kind and good person, a role model to emulate, and presented really as just simply a noble version of the traditional great rabbi, traditional rabbi. And an example, again, many famous stories about Salanter. One is that one year on the way to shul for Yom Kippur, for Kol Nidre no less, he passes his house and hears a child crying. The baby was crying because the mother was eager to get to Kol Nidre, so she put the baby to sleep, thought the baby was asleep, and ran off to shul. Baby woke up, no one there to take care of him when he was lying crying. Salanter stayed with the baby. He never showed Yom Kippur. People were really very frightened. Never showed for Kol Nidre. People were looking for him. They finally found him taking care of the baby. Second example of a story, again, he's sort of famous for this, his thoughtfulness and awareness, and people need help. He was invited to the house of one of his wealthiest students. He came. He wouldn't come at first, then he finally came in. He said, in condition that you let me run the dinner. So when they started by washing their hands before the meal ritually, people started to pour water. It was considered, when you pour a lot of water, you bring a lot of blessing. He said, stop. You should use the minimum ounce of water. They said, why? He said, well, the housemaid, they didn't have running water. She has to carry the water on her back. So you should not be getting extra delicate points for washing your hands on the expense or on the back of a hardworking and overtired housemaid.
Wow.
And he ran through the meal very quickly. And afterward, he called her in and apologized. I'm sorry you ran through the meal so quickly. She said to him, Rabbi, God bless you. Every night it drags and people talk and people could say Divrei Torah, but in the end, I'm exhausted and falling off my feet. So thank you. Most famous story of Salanter's life. In 1848, there was a cholera epidemic in Vilna where he lived. Salanter saw the cholera epidemic. The cholera epidemic, highly contagious, and in its final stages, killed a lot of people. People developed diarrhea, dysentery, and dehydrate, and they die, particularly when there's no one to take care of them. Mm-hmm. Salanter organized all the yeshiva students that he could reach into kind of medical Peace Corps. And he had them go around every day, visit homes to make sure that people brought water, gotten to eat, gotten to the strength so they did not dehydrate and die. Every Friday afternoon before Shabbat, he would call his corps together, give them a special talk, reminding them that the Jewish law, saving a life overrides all the commandments and certainly Shabbat. You should not hesitate in any way to do any work, all labor, all fire creation, anything that's needed for the patient, because he was afraid that people out of tradition would be afraid or hesitate to do what's needed on Shabbos. But according to Jewish law, saving a life is the highest value. You're serving God by working on Shabbat, in this case, saving a life. Anyway, to make a long story short, Yom Kippur was coming. The doctors that he was in touch with said to him, you know, it's highly contagious. Yom Kippur is coming. And people who fast will be weakened. Furthermore, they'll be crowded into a crowded shul, close to each other. This is a recipe for contagion. for sick and weakening the immunity and resistance. And so before you know it, this will be a cause of sickness and death. Well, Salanter thought any rabbi worth his salt should then tell the people, do not fast. And he discovered that the official rabbis, the rabbis of synagogues, the chief rabbi of the town, when you asked them privately, they told you don't fast and spend little time in shul, spend time in the fresh air, so you'll not catch anything. But they refused to put out a public notice because, again, I understand who wants to be the traditional rabbi who goes down in history as the one who told his people to eat on Yom Kippur. He waited, but he was concerned that many religious people will hesitate to eat on Yom Kippur if they're not told publicly by a full authority. They will fast and they indeed will endanger their health. He waited until Shabbos Shuvah, the week, the Shabbat between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And when he saw that the rabbis were not going to make a public announcement, he printed up an announcement saying that the law of the Torah is that saving life comes first. Life is the most precious. The Torah was given that we should live by it, and it should enrich our life, not destroy our life. And therefore, by the authority of the Torah, you should not fast this Yom Kippur, and you should not spend too much time in crowded shuls, but try to be out in the fresh air. Wow. Well, it caused a tremendous storm, but he was unfazed again. And the story goes, and there's some argument about the story, but the story goes that he saw that people nevertheless were fasting. So he went to the great synagogue, went up during the service, morning service, brought in the shamash, the sexton, and food, and said, by authority of the Torah, which has given us to live by, we instruct you to make kiddush and to eat and to break the fast. And he showed the way. And here again, tremendous now looking. So this is the Salanter that I knew and I admired and loved from what I studied about him.
So Rav Yitz, what I hear coming through in those stories that you shared there was, number one, I think I've heard you say this before, one might say someone is what's called makil, or is flexible when it comes to fasting on Yom Kippur, but another way of describing that is saying that they're machmir, they're stringent when it comes to pikuach nefesh, the idea of the importance of saving a soul. So I think each of the stories you shared show the importance of human dignity, caring about humans, caring about the health of humans, not at the expense of pushing aside ritual law, but recognizing that it's so important that it overrides ritual law. And I think another thing that's built into what you're describing there as well, which comes up in his writing, is that dual focus, the focus on not only laws between, we call ben adam lamakom, between a human and the creator, but also between adam lachavero, between a human and his friend. So for example, I know Rav Salanter writes about, we would be so careful to make sure a piece of meat is kosher at a butcher, for example. We'd spend hours thinking about it and dissecting, and if you were worried, you would ask the rabbi and all those questions. But when it comes to, let's say, perhaps maybe like stealing in business or doing some other sort of questionable act, not in the ritual space, that one might overlook that easily and say kind of, oh, it's not as important, it's in the human space. And so I think Rav Salanter is kind of modeling for us the importance of not casting aside ritual, but lifting and in some way sometimes superseding the importance of how we treat humans alongside the ritual.
I came to see it's also a religious vision. Is the Torah, is the Jewish tradition, a set of laws and observances, a legal system? Or is it a way of living and going through life with God? Which means compassion, love, caring, concern for your fellow human beings, as God has love and concern for us. It means trying to improve their lives and trying to improve their world, as God wants this world to be improved and repaired, turned into a paradise, into a Garden of Eden. So looking back, I realized that Salanter picked up a problem here. The orthodoxy, and particularly the traditional Judaism of the Eastern Europe, had become habit, root, legal structure. And yes, so people fasted Yom Kippur would find it horrifying or unbelievable to eat on this day. But in fact, if you see it not as a legal system, but as a way of living life in conjunction with God, then you know God wants you to live, wants you to be healthy, and wants that to give primacy when life is at risk. So the failure to do that, the failure to be willing to say it publicly because you thought you would flout people's expectations, that you're encouraging them to violate the law, shows a much deeper religious problem, which is that the religion was not internalized. It was not a worldview. It was not a vision of living. It had become external observances and conformist routine. So I think there was from the beginning, a deep critique in Salanter of the tradition, even though he loved it, and even though he practiced it, and even though he exemplified it at its best. Now, I came to see later in graduate school that something even deeper. He saw that modernity was coming. Now, already it had come, modernity had become the dominant culture of Western Europe. Russia was still backward. Eastern Europe was still industrially, urbanly undeveloped. And so people were living more traditional lives. And the Jewish community was ghettoized, and conformity in that ghetto everybody observed. But he saw that this culture could not be turned back, that it was coming more and more. The development of business and commerce meant that people would become more modern. And the key to the modern culture was choice. You would have multiple lives, multiple ways of living, multiple religions, people living side by side, people exposed to each other. And he realized that this tradition will not stand. When people are conformist, when people are afraid to violate the law, but because no one else violates the law, and suddenly they see that lots of people not keeping this law, he saw that the tradition would not be prepared to stand up to choice. And he felt that if you want to live the Torah and follow God, you have to be capable of not only living a human life, but choosing and not feeling afraid of or distracted by doing external actions that contradict the richness and importance of life itself. So he understood, and the interesting thing about it was, from 1850s, that's why he started a movement. His conception was that the lay people in modernity, the authority of the great rabbis would not be taken for granted, as it was in the ghetto. In fact, authority would flow from the lay people. It would not be government support. The lay people had to support. So they are the people who had to be organized, turned into community, helped to become religiously sensitive and deep people. So that was his main concern. His tragedy was that he didn't succeed with the lay people so much as with the students of yeshiva, who were highly spiritual and highly great seekers. And they followed him, and he had some wonderful students. They created some great schools. For a while, they turned most yeshivas into places where they spent real time working on character and development, personal development. But he could not get them to deal with and to confront choice, internalizing the religion, and so on and so forth. So it's interesting, from 1857 on, and particularly from 1861 on, he moved west. Even though he was a great scholar, recognized authority, spoke Yiddish, he was a magnificent orator, great Talmud scholar. He moved west because he felt that's where modernity is occurring. That's where you have to reach people and help them develop new institutions, new methods, new understanding that would enable them to be Jews by choice and to keep the tradition in a much more deeply internalized and spiritual way, more ethical way. And from 1861 to 1881, he came back occasionally to Eastern Europe, his family, to his work in Eastern Europe. But most of the rest of the time he spent in Königsberg in East Prussia, in Memel, East Prussia, Berlin, Paris, where there were major Jewish communities modernizing and fully exposed. And he tried to develop techniques that would make them able to, to deal with modernity. So I came to see that there's this other side of Salanter, including his own critique of the tradition, that it was not deep enough, humanly enough, balanced enough, it was not ethical enough to compete effectively. So again, what he could do in Eastern Europe, he did his best to support the ghettoized, defensive Haredi solution. But in Western Europe, and notice what that meant. It meant he gave up his mastery of Yiddish and spoke a very limited and broken German. He gave up his standing as a recognized and honored, worshiped great scholar to be simply a consultant and to work with the local rabbis and local communities. But he did that because he had a sense of mission. This was the challenge of Judaism at his time. And I came to see that as what also explains the cholera in Vilna. He understood that he is not just a rabbi or a scholar, that he has to take responsibility for the community and for its policies and speak up or act in this case when the leadership of the community is not doing the right thing. So it is in a way quite, I wouldn't say aggressive, quite assertive. And yet he had this amazing combination of asserting full responsibility as if he was the head of, or at least the primary agent of the Jewish people, while completely modest, self-abnegating, presenting himself in a very minor way, never talked about his accomplishments, never talked about his achievements, never showed his great scholarship except when he had to give a class or when he had to impress people to take sides with him in this confrontation about which way should the religion develop.
Wow, so beautiful. So first of all, I love, because obviously we've spent many years talking about some of these topics, and I learn new things from you every time, so I'm appreciative. A couple of things that I'm noticing you mentioning, first it brings up, this idea that Rav Salanter was living during a time where people might be drawn towards what's called like being nister, being hidden, like developing themselves in a way where they're focusing on their spiritual connection and spiritual development, and not in front of anyone else, and kind of going off into the corner and doing it quietly. And Rav Salanter saying, that's not what I'm striving for. I'm not striving to be like a famous, hidden gem. I'm striving to be out there and do the work and roll up my sleeves. And more so, what you're describing, whereas he had a following and students in Eastern Europe to decide to pick up and go somewhere where he was not as comfortable with the language and he had less of a following, and to try to show up there and have an impact because he recognized that was the opportunity to make the most impact. I know the metaphor he shares is the idea of horses running down a mountain. That if the horses have been let go of the stables, everything's falling apart. The horses are stampeding down the mountain. Eastern Europe, they're stampeding down the mountain. So trying to turn the horses around and send them back up while they're going down the mountain is impossible. Whereas Western Europe, they had landed there already, and now they were at the bottom of the mountain. You could try to walk them back up. But I hear also in your description this kind of interesting challenge, which is we don't want to depend on conformity. We don't want to depend on communal norms that kind of routinize and make sure that everyone is following the law. We want people to recognize that they, by nature of modernity, have the opportunity to opt in, and we want them to develop practices that'll help them opt in. And then, I think one of the challenges you're dealing with there is that, of course, humans are human. And so when it's kind of forced upon you in a community, it gets you there, but it sounds like Rav Salanter would say you're missing the point. You're not connecting to the becoming a mensch part, you're kind of just following practice. But on the other end of the spectrum, you have the concern that if you're depending on yourself to make choices on a daily basis, you're going to figure out what it means to be a mensch instead of kind of just keeping up with what the law says and letting the law decide for you what it means to be a mensch. How do you navigate that meaningfully forward, and what are the challenges that come with that?
You did a very good point here, but that is the dialectic. Salanter has a great line in our book that we translated. In one place he said, to be a full Jew or a good religious person, you have to have every human quality and its opposite. Mm-hmm. And here is a good example. To develop religiously, spiritually, personally, you have to really spend a lot of time in self-analysis, so work on your own character. You have to really hear your internal voice and become very individual. At the same time, if you keep doing this and nothing else, this is the crisis of American culture, right? Individualism turns into self-centeredness. It turns into simply atomistic existence, self-centered and selfish. So it needs to be balanced by a real sense of collective. Furthermore, as Salanter himself points out, working with a group, working in a community helps you much more develop this internal deep richness. So he tried to create this dialectical experience of pursuing individual and self-fulfillment and God connection without turning into a self-centered Kabbalist or a self-centered tzaddik, righteous person who has no time for anybody else and is ignoring the community. Is not very useful, helpful to other people who need help. So I love one of his famous jokes or lines. Many students wanted to study advanced Torah. They said, well, this is known as Torah Lishma. You're studying Torah for its own sake, not for reward. So they didn't want to go into the rabbinate. They wanted to simply sit and study. We have this crisis in Israel now where people are saying, I can study full time. I don't have to go in the army. I don't have to go to work. I don't have to. Salanter's comment was that's not acceptable. And that so what's his answer? The answer again is that you have to balance this search and this personal with a real sense of obligation or responsibility and relationship to what the community needs you to do. And again, this is one of the reasons why it didn't become a mass movement. Not everybody is willing to undertake such a stringent ritual and ethical discipline and work and so on. But I think it remains to this day the critical point. America, as I said, postmodern culture in general, is facing the crisis of how good things, individualism, self-fulfillment, affirming and enjoying life, can turn into narcissism and turn into hedonism and a loss of value and meaning. And there's been a comeback of fundamentalist and even jihadi forms of religion because many people feel it's not fulfilling. I'm enjoying it, but I'm getting a good time, but it's not really sense of purpose. Salanter's point was we have to recover that sense of purpose, not in the enemy of life, not as the dismissal of the other's needs, but in the context of absorbing and embracing your community. And again, it calls for dialectical contradictory qualities. So you work on both, and you need help for both. But again, if you can do that, you come out as a much richer person, and more important in his case, it means that you will have the inner gyroscope to choose and to live Jewish without feeling a need to fight, dismiss, or be afraid of, or be overwritten by. The great crisis of Haredi community is that they are afraid to mix, because if they mix, they lose their religious commitment. Salanter's point was, you're going to live in a society where everybody is mixing, and God wants you to live a religious life. So you have to learn how to do that. Right. And that's not easy, but that was his idea.
Rav Yitz, in our final minute, I want to leave you with a question and request a short answer, which is as follows. Thinking about your learning, thinking about your commitment to being a mensch, someone comes to you and says, give me a headline. I want to be a mensch in my life. What's your advice to them? What's the eitzah? What's the headline if you're trying to help someone go on a path to becoming a better person through Judaism?
Well, so my first answer is that I wasn't a mensch. I didn't get you to talk about what brought you to Mussar, because I think really what attracted me to you in the first place was that you had on your own studied Mussar in Israel and brought it home. And as a lawyer, created a learning Mussar for lawyers. And as a teacher at Ramaz, developed, classes in self-development and ethics and so on for teachers and for parents as well as for students. So I'd say you have to answer that question in part for me. Why don't you try?
Fine. With respect, I'll answer that, sure. Well, I'll close with that. That's fine. So I think, what I take away from Mussar is, at the very headline level, and this goes back to Rav Salanter, is that it's step one is really setting out a strategy for what you're trying to accomplish. So in Rav Salanter's time, the response to modernity was part of it, but also deep in it was the idea that your life leads to a judgment at the end of your life. And so living your life in a way in which you are judged for the good and not for the bad. So I think it's not for me to tell people what the big goal is, but clarifying what is your big goal of your life? What does success look like? And then clarifying the challenges that come with that. What are the obstacles in your way? Is it your ego? Is it the community that you're in that's putting pressure a certain way? But what are the challenges that are holding you back? And then looking to Torah to guide you on that path. What wisdom does Torah have to share? And then developing strategies around that. How are you going to get there? And so, for example, if you are someone who feels like a goal of life is to feel connection and closeness to God, and you are finding that you're struggling with trusting in God, you're feeling anxiety, you feel like things are not working out as they should, and you're constantly worrying, then you would want to clarify, well, what are my challenges? What are the challenges in my life that are causing me to feel anxious? What are the things that are keeping me up at night? And what are the things that are beyond my control that I need to lean into trust? And then you would study some text around trust, similar to the image you described to us of being in that Beit Midrash in Navardic when you were young. And then you would set a course for yourself for what practices and work am I going to do to try to build up that trust so that I can reach a phase or a place in my life where I feel like I have trust in God and where I'm not experiencing the same level of stress or anxiety where I might otherwise not have trust. So that's one example. So I'll pause there. I'm sure you have more to say and I have more to say. You want?
I love that. You said it better than I could have possibly said it. I'll say it in one further sentence just to make it. In effect, Salanter is saying to walk with God is to embrace life and all God's creatures and all God's world. So if you can do this, if you can deepen yourself, and the tradition is available and the community is available to help you, if you can do that, I would summarize that the life you enrich may be your own. The life you save, the life you ennoble may well be your own. And I see that as the future of Mussar, taught and exemplified by people like Justin Pines.
Thank you.
But I think that is what Mussar can become, like Hasidim and like Kabbalah and like other traditions. Halacha, learning, can become another rich stream of tradition which people can choose to live by in the modern world.
Beautiful. Thank you, Rav Yitz. Thank you so much. Again, the new book, Ori Sorel and Other Writings by Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, is available from Koren now. If you want to learn more about Mussar, if you want to read about Rav Yitz's journey and my journey and more about Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, there are essays on there as well. Rav Yitz, thank you so much. What an amazing zchut to have you. And I hope people get exposed to this book and learn more from you. Thank you so much.
Be well.